Hi there, my name is Jess Dempsey. I'm a professor at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, and I'm coming to you from Vancouver on unceded, ancestral, and traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. As the conservation community reckons with the failure to progress on all 20 Aichi biodiversity targets, a prominent explanation has been the lack of resources directed towards biodiversity conservation, the so-called funding gap. The focus on filling this gap with innovative private sector financial schemes tends to treat austerity, the lack of public investment in public services, systems, and goods, as a kind of immutable reality. Enticing private finance, however, has serious limits. A recent expert report on finance and biodiversity commissioned by the Convention on Biological Diversity concluded that private finance alone will never be sufficient for all the challenges of achieving the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Instead of ineffective and unproven efforts to coax private finance into achieving CBD implementation, we suggest focusing on generating public resources through multilateral tax reform and debt restructuring. While these are often considered outside the scope of biodiversity policy, and these strategies rarely appear in conservation advocacy, however, we think that if we're serious about addressing the underlying drivers of biodiversity and other crises together, then these structural issues must be on the table. So one approach to dealing with the lack of domestic public funding for biodiversity and health, climate, education, and so on, is to focus on reversing the decades-long race to the bottom in corporate and wealth taxes and ending tax avoidance and illicit financial flows. Both of these patterns strip public coffers and increase wealth concentration. Now, while the secrecy practices and regulations afforded by tax haven makes it difficult to quantify with precision, Fortune 500 companies are estimated to have a $2.3 trillion in offshore accounts and capital positions, costing governments between $500 to $600 billion a year, with an estimated loss to low-income economies of $200 billion, eclipsing development assistance. Individual wealth sheltered in tax havens is estimated at $8 to $36 trillion, costing public accounts further, with low and income middle countries losing the most. For comparison, finance needed to preserve global biodiversity is estimated at $700 to $900 billion per year. Although more research is needed into this relationship between tax havens and biodiversity loss, the use of tax havens has been shown to reduce transparency, providing cover for illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, providing cover to bribery and tax evasion in mining projects, and obscuring capital flows that support deforestation in the Amazon. The UN UNCTAD, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, estimated annual illicit financial flows out of African countries to be around $90 billion, with almost half related to the export of extractive commodities. The G7 countries recently reached an interim agreement on tax reform that will have multinational corporations pay a minimum tax rate of at least 15% in each country they operate in. And while this is a worthwhile step, the rate is still far too low, and it's insufficient in terms of redistributing wealth globally and generating the public resources needed to address global social and environmental challenges such as biodiversity loss. Instead, governments concerned with global biodiversity objectives should endorse the recommendations of the recently concluded high-level panel on international financial accountability, transparency, and integrity for achieving the 2030 agenda. And this calls for the creation of an international tax convention, a tax system really capable of a just and fair capture of wealth to support needed public investment in health and environmental objectives. If now is the moment to build a tax regime capable of redistributing the spoils of hundreds of years of uneven development, it's also time to address the debt austerity nexus, which, by continuously draining public coffers and obstructing public financing of countries in the global south, is impeding investment in biodiversity, climate, health, and education. Ongoing legacies of colonialism mean that countries in the global south really rely on debt that is much more expensive than that accessed by countries in the north, with terms and conditions that are certainly not in their favor. Since low-income countries have a small domestic lender base, the vast bulk of this borrowing is foreign denominated, making borrowing countries vulnerable to developed countries' monetary policy change, and it really makes them reliant on foreign currency to make payments. Estimates of developing countries' debt are around 11 trillion US dollars, with debt service payments estimated at 3.4 trillion US dollars annually. One research group recently found that the share of global South government resources dedicated to foreign debt repayment tripled from 2011 to 2020, and rising levels of debt service are directly related to falling domestic spending. So really, more research is needed on this relationship between indebtedness, austerity, and biodiversity loss, as credit can be a lifeline for many nations to invest in health and environmental objectives. But it is clear that debt with attendant fiscal conditionalities that mandate austerity and prompt extractivist investment, conditions that have been linked to reduced forest cover and biodiversity, this kind of debt is particularly problematic. Now, these underlying drivers were recently recognized by the head of the convention, the executive secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity, who recently noted in an interview in the journal Nature that it is difficult to achieve any CBD objectives without addressing agricultural expansion in the global south, an expansion that's driven in many cases by a need for these countries and their economies to earn hard currency to pay their debts to international lenders. Those were her exact words. And COVID-19 has only worsened the situation in countries such as Belize and Mozambique, which are drowning in debt due to tourism collapse and compounding climate change impacts. In response to developing country advocacy, the G20 did provide short-term debt relief, but it was only temporary, only directed at the poorest nations, and did not decrease overall debt levels. In 2020, developing countries, excluding China, paid 194 billion US dollars to creditors. So this is the year that they should be spending on health and pandemic response, spending on average almost 1.5 times servicing loans as they did on public health care. Further straining countries, 84% of IMF emergency loans at the outset of the pandemic required austerity measures of recipient countries. So really the results of this debt austerity nexus is that there are trillions of dollars in debt repayment required at the same time that austerity measures constrain public expenditure in vital social sectors required to not only address the pandemic, but of course to invest in climate change mitigation and adaptation, and to invest in the needed actions to conserve and sustainably use biodiversity. So now these conditions will clearly not be corrected with an increase in protected areas, including efforts such as the 30 by 30 target. They won't be corrected with voluntary efforts by the financial sector, by boutique impact investing projects, or even concerted efforts to end subsidies harmful to biodiversity. As of course important ending those subsidies is. What is needed, we argue, is sovereign debt restructuring and even forgiveness in line with the CBD objectives and decisions, allowing governments to prioritize investments in public services as well as pandemic recovery that is just and sustainable. In conclusion, rich countries are more responsible for and have benefited most from this model of global development that has really driven biodiversity loss. At the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio, countries in the North committed to paying the cost of addressing global environmental problems. These governments must make good on this commitment to pay their ecological debts and compensate for economic growth and wealth accumulation incurred via environmental destruction in the South. Justice-oriented global tax reform and debt forgiveness are crucial to realizing the still unmet common but differentiated responsibility objective forged in 30 years ago in Rio, manifesting in the CBD as Article 20. Given the amassed ecological debts by the North and colonial responsibility for the production of the so-called Third World, such actions are not charity, aid, or even forgiveness. but rather one step towards righting wrongs and the dismantling of an entirely unfair, unjust, and predatory political and economic system.